That Jacob Rees-Mogg interview,
Yeah.
that was just extraordinary, wasn't it? Did it what was he like before and after? Did you see him before? Or were you just in another room and you were brought in?
Yes. I mean, I literally was just taken in to sit down because he'd been interviewing people previously. I was slightly nervous about it because I thought this is a very unlikely person to be talking to me about a royal book. So I did have an instinct how it might be set up, but the person who booked it is someone I've done GB News quite a lot in the past. I've put authors on there. And so I thought, it'll be fine. And if it's a little bit tough, that's fine. I'm very happy to answer questions. But then he didn't really look me in the eye when I went in and we were being mic'd up. And I just got more and more of an instinct that this was not going to go like in most interviews. And then when the cameras stopped rolling, he carried on. He had some comments saying you can't sack him as Chancellor of State because he's born to that role. And I hadn't even mentioned that, not even the book or anything. And then he said, "Well, I hope you made lots of money," as I walked out. So I got a pretty good sense of where he was coming from.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right about just classic Etonian bully behavior. I mean, his politeness has always been a very thin veneer, hasn't it?
Yeah, well, I think it did. You're absolutely right. The veneer got lifted, and I mean, what was really lovely was the way that everyone had sort of written in and saying this is not really the way to behave, and actually it encouraged people to buy the book. So he did me a favor, but yeah, it was unpleasant. But I'm expecting to have a bit of flack from people who clearly don't share my view that even as a monarchist, the monarchy needs to adapt. It can't just cover up what's going on. Is like a sort of 18th century sort of parliamentary system.
Yeah. I mean, interestingly enough, I've been reading books recently about the Georgians up to King Edward VIII, and especially in the Victorian era, the stories about the monarchy were much more open in terms of people knew much more about the monarchy and the scandals, whether it's Prince Eddie and his sort of homosexual brothel, or whether it was Edward VIII, or also all his various scandals with all the kind of the various women. The kind of scandal rags were much more um, able to talk about these stories than they are now, arguably.
Gosh, that's very interesting. God, yes, that's very interesting. Um,
Yeah.
I mean, I've just been reading Fern Riddle's book, which is on the relationship between Queen Victoria and John Brown, and that's always been poo-pooed and everything. And she found records in Aberdeen Public Library that the Brown family had kept. And I think she makes a very persuasive case, and not just for a romantic relationship, but possibly even a child that was taken to New Zealand. But that all, all the royal stuff has been weeded, or certainly not been made available. So this, in some ways, my Andrew book is just a culmination of a series of books where I've been sort of questioning royal transparency over, particularly over records. How they try and curate the story, even for things that were a long time ago. And actually, several of authors I know have had terrific problems writing about Victoria. I think one of her daughters had an illegitimate child or something. But all these stories that are 200 years old are still being suppressed.
I mean, right from King Edward VIII burning all of the correspondence between Victoria and John Brown and Victoria and Abdul, and then going right up to the 90s when you've got Princess Margaret in the back of, I guess, Kensington Palace or Clarence House. Where was it? Clarence House she was in. I can't
Yes, with the chauffeur burning everything.
Yeah, she was burning all of Diana's letters. So,
Yeah.
and so it goes on.
Well, I mean, I'm doing Prince Philip at the moment, and he, in the term was arranging his papers for the last few years of his life. So I think they may have been arranged in the same way as Princess Margaret's.
Right, that's very interesting. There's a fun story in Craig Brown's book about Prince Philip, which, well, I say fun because one of my questions to you is about the behavior of the royals as Andrew was growing up. And Prince Philip was a complete bastard to his servants as well. And we've all seen the sort of footage of him shouting at the photographer to get the fuck on with it. But he also told Cecil Beaton to get the fuck on with it after the coronation. And Cecil Beaton said, "You can take the photos then," and started to walk out. And then he kind of apologized. Okay, let's start from the beginning then, Andrew. What sort of got you into writing about the royals? I remember reading last year that you had a kind of mentor in this kind of area, but
Yeah, I started writing actually literary biography. My first book was on John Buck, and I'd grown up in Scotland. I'd read his books. And I edited John Buchan's short stories. I wrote a book about Edinburgh. I don't think I've read a royal book until probably my 50s. And then I moved into intelligence, and that's where I came across John Costello. And he was, when I was at Cambridge, he wanted me to research a book on Anthony Blunt. And so from Anthony Blunt, I got the idea of doing a book on Guy Burgess, and I began to research people there from the 80s. But I didn't actually publish that book until 2015. I was working, I had a family. So I was really an intelligence historian. My doctorate is intelligence history. Doing that, Guy Burgess took me on to Mountbatten because I'd read the Philip Ziegler's book. The two of them had been at Dartmouth, they'd been at the same prep school, and I felt that the Mountbatten book didn't really tell the full story. And so I began to do some research there, and that's where I began to have my sort of concerns about official secrecy and where I sort of moved into royal books. But it was a book really about a man, who was actually in his own right a very impressive figure, as the last viceroy, etc. But as a result of that, I then moved on to another person who'd been at Dartmouth and in the Navy briefly, and that was the Duke of Windsor, which again, having begun to read some books by this stage, I began to get a sense that we weren't getting the full picture. And I'd always felt that, there was more to the story than the great love story of the 20th century, but also about his Nazi connections. The line, they went so far, they would say he was very naive. But reading, for example, Michael Bloch's book, Operation Willie and others, it was very clear that, I mean, he was going along with this attempt to trap him to work for the Nazis during the war. So I just thought I'll do a bit of research, and most, I'm afraid, at that stage, and I think even still now, most royal historians, rely on handouts from the palace, secondary sources, and newspaper cuts. They don't really do much original research, and I found that there was a lot of material, particularly in private archives abroad. A lot of stuff gets sold, for example, at auction, and so there was. I did Traitor King. So that I then thought, well, actually, I've been doing these books, which have been looking at royals through the prism of their marriages. So we had the open marriage of Mountbatten. We had the great love story of the 20th century in the Windsors. And I'd always then been intrigued by the statement the Yorks made that they were the happiest divorced couple ever. And everyone would seem to find it really odd that a couple who had separated after 6 years were actually living together sort of 40 years later. I mean, it didn't surprise me. I mean, there are plenty of married couples who separate and still remain good friends and co-parent. But anyway, that was a sort of line that they pushed. And so I started looking at that. And then, of course, Andrew was in the news a lot. I started this in 2021. So after the Newsnight interview, and I felt there was a good story there, which had never really been told. I mean, I was amazed. There'd been one biography by Ingrid Seward of Fergie sort of 30 years ago, which she had cooperated with, and a couple of books in 1982 by people like Andrew Morton, but just cuttings jobs when he came back from the Falklands. And I thought, actually, there's a good story here. So, and my other thing, that the instinct was that they were particularly, I would say, rogue royals, but there was the way that the members of the royal family have leveraged their royal status to make money personally, which I think is wrong. And I think a lot of people share that view. And I felt sorry because it seemed to undermine the good work other royals were doing who didn't abuse their position like that. And even people, non-working royals, like Lord Lindley, for example, has had a very successful career without piggybacking off his royal status. So that was how it all sort of came together. And a lot of people said to me when I started, well, who's interested in Andrew? He's very dull. But actually, as I began to research it, there were all sorts of questions. I mean, is he the great Romeo with 1,000 women, or is he a carpet and slippers man? And I got different views the whole time. I mean, is he really as awful as they say? There must be some redeeming features, etc. So that's how it began. And it's taken me 4 years. I got from a guy called Phil Dampier, who's a journalist who actually collects cuttings on the Royals, 6 crates of cuts going back to the 1980s. And that took me a couple of years just to just put that into a chronology of 12 lever arch files. But I then had a story almost literally day by day from various papers, a lot of them, of course, not digitalized. And that began to give me a sort of database of about 1,000 people that I could contact. Which I did through the electoral roll, LinkedIn, Who's Who, school lists, you name it, social media. And that's how it sort of began to happen. And then clearly putting in lots of FOI requests on Andrew. A lot of the papers on Andrew, there are some papers at the National Archives, but they're all closed. And so I began to try and get some of those released. I mean, really innocent things like parachute training, 1978. which is still closed under the grounds of national security. And I began to see that there was a big story here, which had been missed. I think everyone has got slightly sidetracked with Harry and Meghan. And the Queen. And anyway, it seemed to me that there was a good story. And I think by the reaction to the book, it's shown that there was.
So, Andrew is clearly involved with some extremely dangerous and influential people. Were you scared or concerned about your own welfare in the process of writing the book? And were there any kind of strange happenings that got your heckles up in that process?
Yeah, I've never really felt that I was under physical threat. I mean, I think there have been attempts to discredit me and undermine my authority. I mean, I had a couple of odd episodes. For example, my Kazakhstan researchers drew a blank largely because they said that people felt so scared of Andrew and his links with the ruling establishment that they daren't talk. And I mean, that was also the problem with Andrew and Fergie's staff, that they all signed NDAs and they were petrified of being come after. I met one Russian who, I don't know if he was some sort of Walter Mitty figure, but he insisted on meeting at a particular hotel in Kensington. And he must have recognized because he met me outside the door and said, maybe our phones are bugged, so we're going to walk around the corner and go to a tea shop. So we went to the tea shop. And then he said, well, we're going to communicate. You must give me another email. So I gave him the email of someone in my family to use. And he said, when I say something, I mean exactly the opposite. So if I say I haven't found anything, I have found something, and we're to meet at some on the second Wednesday at this place. So I felt I was being drawn into some sort of spy thing. He never did find anything, so he kept saying he'd found something, so I assumed he hadn't found anything. So I never went to my little meeting place.
Okay, so let's start from the beginning with Andrew. Tell me about sort of briefly, just tell me about his childhood, and the context of that, and how it potentially kind of set him up to be the person that he became.
Well, I think the childhood is crucial, and I think he was the second wave of the Queen's children. I think she spoilt him. I mean, she admitted that. I think she found him, lively, cheeky. He appealed to perhaps something in her character because she wasn't naturally like that. And she said she had spoilt him, and he had no boundaries. He was a very naughty little boy, and no one dared do anything. And I think he just picked up that he could do what he wanted and he could get away with it. And that attitude has gone all the way through his life. I mean, to the present day, where, if he's in for example, a golf club. It's a story I picked up in Switzerland. And you're told not to use your mobile. He'll very ostentatiously use his mobile. At Gordonston, when there was a roll call, he didn't feel that he had to go to roll call. So he's had this sense of entitlement all his life, and I think people have been scared to challenge him. And I talked to a protection officer and said, "Why didn't you try and sort of steer him in the right direction when sometimes he's going off the rails?" And he said, "Well, my job was to protect him, and when I did try and say things, they said to me, well, do you want to carry on doing this job, which is nice perks, or do you want to go back on the beat in Brixton?" And I think that happened. A lot of Navy people as commanding officers, wanted to be tougher with him. But people further up would say, no, we can't do that. We've got to give him a good report. Prince Philip would come down and inspect them, and ask what was going on, if anything critical was said about him. So he had these very inflated 260s, they're called, all the way through his career until there was a point where a naval officer said to Jock Slater, who was the first Sea Lord, look, this guy can go no further. He's reached the limit of his abilities, and he's got to go out. And Slater said, "Yeah, well, you do. Give him a fair report." And then I think Prince Charles heard that he was leaving, and I think realized that he was better within the structure and discipline of the Navy, and so they kept him on a bit longer at the Ministry of Defence and a couple of invented jobs that no one took over the jobs when he left. So I think that's what shaped him. And then I think marrying Fergie, not the greatest move. I mean, she, I think drew him into a world of wanting to move with the jet set. He'd always had that, even at school. He was envious of the Niarchos family who were at Gordonston. But I think then, I think if he'd married Kustok, it might have been slightly different. They would have been a bit more low key and she would have been very discreet. But Fergie is very, very greedy and she wants to make money, and she spends money and gets into debt. And then he was forced to try and um, help her with this debt. I mean, that's how she got caught in the sting operation with the News of the World, offering access to him for £500,000. It's why, he got close to Epstein to a large extent because Epstein was paying Fergie's bills. So, I mean, there were sort of forks in the road where things could have been different. But I think essentially he is a very pompous, arrogant man. I mean, there are dozens of stories in the book from a whole range of people just backing that up. I mean, someone said he believes in the divine right of kings, and he's a sort of narcissist. Everything is seen through his own eyes, which is why I think he found it difficult to have any sense of feeling for these poor trafficked girls like Virginia Giuffre. Um, because it's only about his pleasure and his needs rather than thinking of anyone else. And that's why I think he's so awful, for example, to staff, where he's very different. So yeah, I mean it's sort of an accident been waiting to happen, is what people said to me.
So if we look back through the kind of Windsor line, as it were, I mean, firstly, there's a rage in the Windsor family that goes right back to George III. And the Queen's father, indeed, was known for huge rages against his servants. Prince Philip is known, and there have been stories of him being a bully as well. Do you think
Yeah.
that part of Andrew's behaviour is learnt behaviour? He grew up in a family that basically didn't really see servants as human beings, treated them accordingly. And so the way he treats people is something that he's learned from the way his father treated people, for example, or even his mother. His mother's corgis. There's one story about his mother's corgi attacking a servant's foot so badly that they ended up going to hospital. And the Queen's response was, "Well, you got in my dog's way." So,
Yeah.
there are
Yeah.
stories from both his father and his mother of being callous or indifferent or contemptuous of servants. And so, do you think to some extent it's learnt behaviour?
Yeah, I think there's a lot in that. I mean, I think he did pick up a lot from particularly his father. So his rather adversarial, accusatory way of dealing with people on walkabouts, for example, he's like a naval officer barking things at them rather than trying to draw them out. Um, the very sort of Germanic, rather sort of scatological humor, again, I think comes from his father. The need to be this macho man, the boss, absolutely comes from the father. But then, you see someone like Prince Edward, who has in some ways the same upbringing, and there's no one has ever suggested he behaves like that. He's a very sensitive, intelligent, thoughtful, considerate sort of person. And though Princess Anne can be pretty brusque and direct, I think basically, she is a very good person. And Charles, again, though he can appear petulant, everyone says he treats his staff pretty well. This guy I interviewed, well, yeah, I quote the book called Colin Burgess, who was equerry to the Queen Mother, and he did make this distinction that the Queen Mother and others treated people like they were companions and friends, the staff, whereas Andrew was very different. And I think it's because he lacks a sense of identity. He relies on status to give him his particular sort of position. And I think, lots of people talk about him putting on his prince's hat, for example, in the Navy. He's never quite sure when he's the naval officer and mucking in with people and when he's the prince. And again, lots of stories at weekend parties where he's been, very jovial and they've been very casual in their relations and let's say playing cards at night. And then the next morning, he expects everyone to stand up and say, "Good morning, sir." There's a story in the book about David Anderson, who was a long-term senior courtier at Hillsborough, and describing the Queen Mother. Describing yes, Queen Mother as Queen Mother rather than Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth. And Andrew goes ballistic. And this is someone he would have known 30 years probably, and the man was considerably older than him. So it's I think he's just unsure of his position. And I wonder if, getting up into dressed in his uniforms and getting into the robes of the garter, all these things are about hiding actually a rather insecure personality around the trappings of power.
One of the things that you talk about is the Queen's unwillingness to begin with. So in the 90s, when there were lots of negative stories against Andrew, he asked his mother to use her influence to try and stop them, and she didn't. And we saw the same thing play out with Harry and Meghan in terms of them begging kind of Charles to try and use his influence to stop the press doing what they were doing, and again he didn't. Um, but then later on, the Queen was happy to kind of use her influence to try and quash stories about him and do that classic thing where they trade other things for the press. Look at this, don't look at this, that kind of thing. Why do you think the Queen had that reticence early on to use her influence to protect him from the press?
So he's sent off to Los Angeles on a solo tour. He's going to be the new poster boy of the monarchy. And then he kind of self-sabotages, as he often does, and turns this paint gun on the journalists, causing thousands of pounds of damage to their equipment and their clothes. And the Queen says he's got to pay compensation. So you're absolutely right. And I think, she is putting the monarchy ahead of her family. But you're absolutely right that later on, and I think it's only in the last few years of her life, the thing switches. I think, she doesn't want to get in all the battles. That's why she allows Christopher Geidt, who is one of the, I think, major architects of the modern monarchy, very shrewd man who was a private secretary. Andrew and Charles gang up against him because he wants a much more unified sort of command structure, and they don't like that. And so they gang up against him, and he's out. And I think from that point onwards, I mean, she just can't be bothered to fight. I mean, the big question to me is why Philip didn't sort of discipline him a bit more, because I think he was a great stickler for doing things properly. But we have stories about, I mean, even before he becomes special trade envoy, which is the real problem, but stories of her trying to shut down stories. And I think there's a report I have from Private Eye. But certainly, special trade envoy, 2001, 2011, pretty quickly, people are going to Robin Javern, her private secretary, diplomats and politicians, saying, "Look, this isn't working. He's putting his foot in it, and we don't think this is a great idea." And nothing is happening. And I talked to, for example, a former head of the Foreign Office, and he said the same. They just gave up complaining about him. Nothing was being done.
To that point, there's a quote in your book where you say they knew exactly what was going on. People are not going to like it, but the Queen was colluding in this. I originally thought she just put her head in the sand, but I increasingly have come to the view that she knew exactly what was going on and allowed it to happen. Can you expand on that? Why do you think that's the case?
We had, the episode I talk about, Amy Robach at ABC, who had found had the story, interviewed Virginia Giuffre, and had all the Andrew connections years before the story broke. And when the palace heard about it, they said, "Look, if you want to have any future access to members of the royal family, then you need to drop this investigation." So it's all the things that you say, the carrot and the stick, and they dropped it. And I do quote other episodes where things were done to deflect attention from something.
I suppose the question is, you say in the book, and you lay out the evidence really quite clearly. And the idea that Janvrin hadn't gone to the Queen and told her about all these various complaints, the Queen was a bit like Queen Victoria. She liked her gossip, the Queen. She liked to know what was going on. So clearly she knew what was going on, but she didn't seem to care.
Yeah.
So why do you think that is?
Well, I think, she something flipped, and she began to put, or maybe she lost her marbles. I mean, that she just had this blind spot with her son. And actually, I've got another story, which it was taken out of the book by the lawyers, but basically an activity in Kazakhstan, which was illegal, and it was reported to Geidt by MI6. And Geidt said, "Look, there's no point me raising this because nothing will happen." So I find it hard to explain, because I think we all have terrific respect for the Queen. She was driven by public duty, and the monarchy was everything. And as you say, she was prepared to, let things happen with Harry and Meghan and Charles and Diana, rather than risk the monarchy. Though Andrew and Fergie, when they began to sort of have scandals around them, the toe licking episode and all those other things, the Queen was pretty ruthless in saying you must divorce. They wanted to cut themselves loose from Fergie. I mean, they never quite managed, but the idea was that she was bringing the monarchy into disrepute by sucking toes in the south of France. And so, she did have that very strong sense, certainly in the 90s. But as you say, I think in the last few years, it was ridiculous. I mean, he would be quoted doing something with Epstein, and she would sort of give him another honor, or she would walk him, ask for him to walk her to a seat or sit beside him in a car going to Balmoral to create the church. And I think, partly it's showing solidarity. Everyone began to think, well, maybe there was no truth in the Virginia Giuffre allegations, because this woman wouldn't have behaved like this if there were. And maybe it was a sort of bluff. You're absolutely right. She knew exactly what was going on, very well connected. and really good sources of stuff being fed back. I mean, one of the sources, for example, the Duke of Windsor, were the protection officers who reported back to the monarch on Duke of Windsor, and I'm sure they did the same to her.
Well, you
And
also mentioned in the book that MI5 have extensive files on Andrew and Epstein, and you also hint, or even probably more than hint, a few times that some of the sort of scandalous embarrassments in regards to Sarah Ferguson were potentially even leaked and gathered by the secret services. Could you kind of expand on that a little bit as well?
yeah, I mean, Andrew Morton has a bit in his book that when Sarah was going to marry Andrew, that the sort of MI5 were brought in to sort of dry clean apartments, get rid of embarrassing photos. Uh, um, and her flatmate said I was left with nothing as a sort of memento of her. And there have been one or two pictures of, her in the bathtub and stuff taken when she was a chalet girl. But there were what concerns about her time as a chalet girl because she'd clearly had a pretty racy time. Those stories would emerge. And it's very interesting. I did approach a lot of those people in that circle, and they just weren't prepared to talk. I mean, clearly, some pressure being put on them. And a lot of these people, they were drug addicts, people like that, not people you would think could be easily controlled. So, clearly there are pressures that can be put on people. But yeah, I mean, certainly when she had a relationship with Steve Wyatt, I think Steve Wyatt was basically read the Riot Act and he returned to the States. And the worry there was not so much, that she was having an affair, but that Steve Wyatt had business connections with enemies of this country, and she was entertaining him at Buckingham Palace and getting some of his business associates to have dinner at Buckingham Palace, and they didn't like that. So there's a story that they actually leaked photographs that of the two of them together, which proved to be embarrassing, and that doesn't wouldn't surprise me. Someone talks, I think James Steed talks, a journalist, of having a meeting in a car park in South London with someone he thought was an intelligence figure about these pictures of Steve Wyatt on holiday with them that somehow appeared at the top of a cabinet that they couldn't understand how it got there. So I think there were some dirty tricks, and I mean there's always been suggestions that some of these tapes that have been found, like the squidgy tapes, have been are genuine, but have sort of not been picked up by chance by radio hams, but have been put out there for people to pick up. So I mean, without sounding conspiratorial, I think the deep state has certainly had some role in this story, and I think certainly Fergie believes that.
And briefly going back to the Queen, do you think she is guilty of a moral abdication when it comes to her son?
Absolutely. No, I mean, I think no one is above the law. And I mean, she's apart from because I think that, people have been calling for a long time that he should be investigated by the National Crime Agency, for example. Everyone gets focused on the Epstein story and the fact that Met didn't want to investigate him. But I think his activities as special representative and what he was doing and how he leveraged that position do justify an investigation. And that was shut down. So I think there is that side, and also the fact that she placed the monarchy in danger by behaving like this. She undermined her own moral authority and the moral authority of the monarchy. And it seems very short term. And I think possibly one of the factors may be when Geit left, she was slightly rudderless. She didn't have good people giving her advice. The danger is you just get sort of sycophants who are, are only too delighted to be in the royal circles, and aren't prepared to speak truth to power in the way that Geit, I think, was. So I think that's possibly where the change came. I think the thing is, there have been lots of scandals which have never come out, I'm told. And the palace have been able to shut them down. So I think the belief is that they can shut these scandals down, and it's only when the scandals emerge that they have to put Plan B into practice. So, and I think if that's the case, then that could be very damaging if that's their attitude.
Um, so one of the things that recurs throughout the book is a kind of institutional dishonesty within the monarchy. Multiple kind of things where you basically the palace just lie blatantly again and again and again until they're caught out, at which point they don't have a choice but to withdraw the fact that they're lying. So do you think that because Andrew had seen his family lie to the press his entire life when it needed to protect itself, he then felt emboldened to lie and obfuscate? So, for example, the ludicrous lie about the sweating, which, as you mentioned in the book, he had to tell the court in America that he didn't have any evidence for that. Do you think again it was a kind of learned behavior? He'd grown up in a family that was very happy to lie to the public for decades, if not centuries.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm glad you brought up that point because I know no one else has. But I mean, I think just the repeated denials of things from the palace when quite obviously, something had happened. And there's actually a little bit in the book where Andrew says to the press on one of these trips, actually, do you know that we've been lying to you, the press, for 20 years? And the press, the palace then said, oh, no, 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 he's got that all wrong. And he denied it. And then the press, actually, I think it was cut from the book, but I went through all the things. The press then said, well, these are all the lies that we know, James Whittaker, for example, that have taken place. But yeah, I think he felt he was protected. He was invincible. And that if something emerged, it would be sorted out. And I think people clearly had stories to tell. And actually, I've had a lot of people come to me the last 2 weeks who now feel emboldened to tell stories, which they didn't know who to go to, I think, in the past, or they were scared. And now I've put my head above the parapet. I think they're keen for some of these stories to come out, which I'm afraid don't depict either Andrew or the royal family in a very favourable light. And I'll stick in a paperback edition.
Well, I can.
So yeah, I think they just got away with it. And who knows how many stories have been covered up.
Do you think that part of the reason that the monarchy or have protected Andrew is because they know full well that Charles has been playing exactly the same kind of tricks? I mean, it doesn't get more corrupt than a Fortnum and Mason bag with 3 million quid and a guy getting a knighthood. And one can only imagine that's the tip of the iceberg. And in a way, it's less defensible for Charles because he's got the Duchy of Cornwall. He really does have tens of millions of pounds coming in. Andrew didn't. I'm not in any way justifying Andrew's behaviour there, but it seems even more shocking that Charles would be up to similar shenanigans. And then even with the Queen, when you look at the people sponsoring the Royal Ascot show, all these little hints, aren't there, of the willingness of the royal family to take money from rich Middle Eastern magnates for favours, I suppose.
I mean, we remember back to the Burrell case, which of course was stopped. I mean, the police had him banged to rights, and they shut the case down when the Queen realised that he was going to go on the stand and talk about Fawcett. And so she then had this mysterious memory again of what she claimed had happened. But absolutely, I mean, I think the defence that's always given is that this is for money for Dumfries House or something else. It's not going into my pocket, but I agree. It places them in a very difficult position. And there are other scandals I know haven't come out. I mean, what was Charles doing with James Sturt, I think, who was the son-in-law of Bernie Ecclestone, and fake pictures at Dumfries House. And they kind of get into bed with a lot of dodgy people that you and I would run a mile from. I mean, we could tell these weren't people we should be involved with, but they don't seem to have that antennae, or they just are greedy. I think they're so used to the fact that one, they don't. It's a bit like people going shoplifting, thinking they're not going to get caught, who don't need to shoplift. I think that there may be more stories coming out, and then if it gets to the center, to the king, then it's going to be a real problem. I mean, there have already been quite a lot of scandals about, for example, Princess Michael and Prince Michael. I mean, they've been caught on film selling access, saying how matey they are with Putin. We've had Zara Phillips and Peter Phillips advertising things in China and getting involved with this guy Johnny Hon in the way that Fergie does. So it's not just Andrew and Fergie. There's a whole range of them who are doing this and making their money piggybacking off their royal status. Yeah, I think it is very worrying. I mean, people have been calling for a royal register, but I'm not sure that it's only as good as their ability to basically fill it in. And what we've also seen with Andrew and Fergie, and I suspect it's elsewhere, and there are hints in the book that people like Charles were involved, is offshore accounts. The Rowlands are saying that they acted for other members of the royal family, and that when they were doing business apart from Andrew. And all these nominee people like Dominic Hampshire and Johan Eliash, who are sort of front men in these companies. So one wonders if there are other sort of people. For example, with Sunninghill and the sale of Andrew and Fergie's home, that was done under a trust. No one knows who the members of the trust are. So it's very difficult to follow the paper trail there.
Yeah, well, let's bring that up again, actually. I mean, that's another thing I noted from your book. It's just one line, isn't it? And you talk about the prince told Jonathan Rowland in one leaked email that he had proposed using Inverness as a vehicle for Qataris interested in investing in a property company associated with his brother Charles. And that's quite a staggering notion, isn't it? And the fact that it comes from Andrew to Rowland, it's not sort of hearsay, it's there in an email. I mean, it could just be that Andrew's lying because he wants to use his brother's name, but it could also very well be that there are financial ties there. So I think it's interesting these kind of really complex financial scandals where you've got offshore and you've got this person and that person, and they're quite hard in a way, aren't they, to grab the public's imagination. And I think that's one of the reasons that they kind of get away with it. Because something like Epstein, it's a very simple thing to grasp. It's young girls who are being trafficked and it's men who are having sex with them. But you can get your head around it. But with the financial scandals, it's really much harder, isn't it, to make them sticky?
I agree, and I mean they're very good at hiding it. I mean, I had forensic accountants looking, and they would scratch their head and say, "This doesn't look right." But we can't quite see, what's going on. I mean, Fergie has a whole series of companies that don't need to be audited because there's supposedly no transactions. So why has she got, dozens of these companies doing nothing? And she keeps setting them up. She keeps doing confirmation statements.
It seems to me that David Rowland is a hugely important person in the figure in Andrew's life and in this scandal and in the book. And you cover it in great detail towards the end of the book. So just for the kind of benefit of the audience, can you just kind of give us an idiot's guide or a kind of rundown? Who is David Rowland? What's his relationship with Prince Andrew, and what's going on as far as you understand it?
Yeah, well, I mean, Blomberg have tried to do a bit of investigation into him too. Actually, quite a lot of the Rowland stuff was cut. I would have liked more, but I could see it perhaps overbalance things. But David Rowland is a man who, in fact, didn't become a treasurer of the Conservative Party because there were concerns about his business practices, and he has a very, I have to be careful for libel reasons, but he has a very checkered business history. He and Andrew are close friends. Andrew goes and opens his banks abroad. Haviland has loaned him money, which he hasn't had to repay or has been repaid by one of Rowland's companies. And there's clearly a very, very close relationship there. Rowland goes to the family weddings. He's been entertained to tea at Balmoral, I think, with the Queen and even with Prince Charles. So it's not just Andrew. This is why one begins to think it's maybe a family business. Yeah, I mean, there was a point where Jonathan Rowland is David Rowland's son, who became the other great contact. These people were being squeezed into these trade promotion trips when Andrew was going on, these taxpayer-paid trips abroad, particularly in places like the Middle East and China. And Andrew's private secretary was asking ambassadors to line up meetings which had nothing to do with the trade promotion, but were all about either Andrew's personal business interests or the Rowlands. And I show some examples of where people they wanted to meet, they met, and business ensued. And in fact, one of Andrew's former private secretaries, now has a pivotal point in economic development in the Middle East and has been fast-tracking banking licenses, for example. So there's a little network that's been set up. I mean, when Amanda Thirsk had to leave his employment as private secretary, she was lined up with a job with a Chinese company that I think he continues to be involved with. So he's got his little people out there. And of course, on these trips, he was also taking his daughters with all the attendant security costs, solely so they could pick up useful business contacts, which they're now exploiting. And that's why I think the government is so reluctant to release any of the papers connected with Andrew as a trade envoy, though by law they should now be in the national records. And I've tried for 4 years at hundreds of FOI requests, and each time they deploy a different FOI exemption to avoid revealing them, saying they've got too much material. When I narrow it, they have nothing, hiding behind health and safety, national security, personal data, cost compliance, you name it. So there's a big cover-up going here. In fact, the Foreign Office told diplomats not to talk to me for this book. Fortunately, a lot of them ignored that. But I did feel that there was an attempt here for the story to be suppressed. I mean, Norman Baker has a line, that all these things are done to protect the dignity of the monarchy, and he says, well, you protect the dignity of the monarchy by behaving in a dignified way, not just by a cover-up. But you raise a really interesting point that no one else has raised, and that is, for example, the relationship with Mark Thatcher. Mark Thatcher was actually a business partner of Andrew in Kazakhstan in the 1990s. And very similar to two slightly dopey boys spoilt by their mothers. But you're absolutely right. I read Mark Hollingsworth's book on Mrs. Thatcher, and I was shocked. I mean, because she had this great reputation as this very upstanding woman, and she was absolutely exactly like the Queen, indulging her son and covering up in a really dishonest way. Mandelson and Blair were in the book. 20 pages were taken out of the book, and I have to say a lot of that stuff was Blair and Mandelson, both of them very rich and very litigious. But I mean, Blair, for example, was very active in Kazakhstan. He set up the photo opportunities with Andrew and the president of Kazakhstan. Mandelson, we've seen little snippets of his involvement with Epstein, going shopping for trousers in the Caribbean and stuff. And Mandelson was very much behind Andrew's appointment. Andrew and Mandelson actually are close. The two of them were the two witnesses at Evelyn de Rothschild and Lynn Forrester's wedding. So it's a little network there. And in fact, when people were concerned about Andrew staying with Epstein too much, they actually, the Rothschilds made their flat in New York available to him if he wanted free accommodation. I mean, he still preferred to go to Epstein even then. So you're right. There's a lot more to this story. Some of it I found and we couldn't put in. Some of it I'm hoping may still emerge. But it's a much bigger thing, and it's about, as you say, well, I won't say government corruption, but it's about a lot of very senior former political figures, particularly in Central Asia, beginning to enrich themselves personally. And Andrew just jumped on that bandwagon. The other person who's taken out was Hunter Biden, and the same thing of a slightly dissolute son protected by a parent. But Andrew and Hunter Biden were involved together in Ukraine, but all that stuff had to come out, unfortunately.
So what can you tell us then about the Mandelson and Andrew connection?
Well, I mean, a bit like, the Trump connection, they were sort of three musketeers together. And Mandelson, whenever anyone is asked him about the relationship with Epstein, he's snapped at them. And I suspect they probably had a letter from Schillings or someone. So I think that's made people reluctant to go there. But, we have some photographic evidence. We certainly have, as I say, these social connections. Now, it doesn't mean that led to business, but some of the stuff they were certainly, so we say, swimming in the same business pools. So I'm hoping maybe by the time of the paperback and we talk again, then there may be more I can tell you. But at the moment, I think I have to be quite careful.
That's incredibly interesting. So how rich do you think Andrew is? Because I mean, you've made the point in the last 6 months, actually. I've seen kind of in interviews and things saying, I think Andrew can well afford Royal Lodge, actually. And I think he's a lot richer than people think he is. I mean, how rich do you think he could be? Obviously, there's no way of us knowing, but I mean, might he have 100 million? Might he have 150 million?
Well, it's a good question. I mean, we've look at the sources of income. So there's the trust funds would have been passed down probably from the Queen Mother. I'm sure the Queen made some, I mean, not necessarily when she died, but sometime before she died, made some sort of provision for him. And so there's the inherited income. I think that there's also clearly the money that he was making from things at Pitch at Palace. We know about, we can see the transactions going through Pitch at the Palace Global, which was the vehicle in which he took this 2% cut of investment income. And I think there's one year he draws £200,000 from it. So I mean, okay, chicken feed, but if a lot of the stuff was happening in China, as we think with Tenbo, and there was a Chinese bank account, then clearly there's a lot of stuff going through there. I mean, what would be interesting is to be able to talk to some of his Coots bankers and find, if they ever were to spill the beans, that would give us some sense. But if the one occasion that we know that he was involved in taking a commission was the Greek water company investing in Kazakhstan, organized by a Swiss finance house. And there he had a £3.85 million commission. It didn't actually happen in the end, but that's sort of money on deals. Then there's clearly quite a lot of money coming in. And there's another story, again, not in the book, but this involves a suitcase with $5 million in it. So again, that's one single transaction for something he was involved in. So, it must all add up. How could he afford a Swiss chalet of, that's worth 15 million pounds? Where, he clearly had that. I can't remember what it was, 15 million that he got from the sale of, or 14 million from the sale of Sunninghill. But he then had 7.5 million to pay for the doing up of Royal Lodge. There was a lot of money going around. One of the things I wanted to say about wealth, which I actually got from the ex-mistress of King Juan Carlos, who's someone else who's very much involved in this era and has been kicked out to Dubai and was involved with Andrew. And the way that he was paid was in jewellery. And the royal family had very close connections with some jewelers, and I've mentioned at least one, if not two, in the book. And I'm not imputing that they do this, but there are jewelers who will then reset stones, presents that they're given, and sell them. And we know, for example, that Tariq Khatuni, the Libyan gunrunner, was giving £18,000 jewelry for example, I think it was Beatrice's 18th birthday party. So a lot of this is done through gifts, and that's how the Middle East do it. And I think one of the other areas that we just got a sense of the sort of money was the Selman Turk case in the High Court in 2022, where Andrew was being paid £750,000, ostensibly to help get a Turkish millionairess a passport, but in fact was money that was coming from Selman Turk to Andrew, which Andrew couldn't explain. And Sarah Ferguson was getting £250,000, one of the daughters was getting £25,000, and none of them had an explanation. They were talking about birthday and wedding presents from people they didn't really know. So that gives you a sense of the sort of large sums of money that are being thrown around.
In the book that, there's all these things where you say a few million here, a few million there, and you kind of think, golly, if he's got clever people, they know how to use his influence and how to make the money. He doesn't need to be clever. He just needs to turn up, basically, doesn't he?
Exactly. He's the front man. I mean,
Yeah.
people said to me, I mean, funny enough, the American editor said, I don't believe in this stuff. He's not bright enough to do this stuff. And I pointed out, he's got good people who do that. He's just the useful idiot.
And I know we don't have any evidence, and we're not making the accusation, but if you were to think about it hypothetically, it's a dream scenario for money laundering because you have a guy in the middle who is never going to be investigated by the police. And so you couldn't have a better money laundering situation than Andrew because nobody's ever going to look into his. I mean, number one, it's easy enough even if you're not Prince Andrew to have all your offshore accounts. We saw in the Panama Papers, which of course his mother was named in. But we saw from the Panama Papers that even if you're not royal, you don't have that kind of protection, you can get away with it. But having Andrew in the middle as a royal, you can imagine that the wrong people with the wrong kind of ideas could be an amazing kind of central plank of a money laundering system, couldn't it?
Absolutely. And that's clearly what the suspicion is. And that's why I think there's a strong case for an investigation by the National Crime Agency.
Your book has garnered an extraordinary amount of enthusiasm. It's already sold over 60,000 copies. We all know that after the enthusiasm and interest shown in your book and around the world, and despite the hundreds of headlines that it's garnered and will no doubt continue to garner, there will be no official inquiries, no criminal investigations, and no change in how the monarchy is allowed to avoid transparency via patronage, access, and constitutional privilege. Do you think that this would have been a bigger story 20 years ago, before the world became too distracting for almost any scandal to be sticky enough for consequences to be seen?
Well, I think 20 years ago, I mean, this book wouldn't have been published. I mean, I was very lucky that Collins are a very sort of robust, particularly the editor, is a very sort of feisty champion of freedom of information and has fought, for example, Russian oligarchs. They have Rupert Murdoch, who is again pretty feisty on these issues. I mean, funny enough, I had lunch with Tom Bauer the other day, and he said, you're lucky to be with Collins because other publishers wouldn't have supported you should there be writs, and we've had a couple, which I think we'll see off. But I think it's I was lucky. I think there has been a bit of a sea change. Seeing actually the comments below the articles is instructive. I would say a lot of them share our concern about what's been going on, that if they've been allowed to get away with things that they shouldn't be allowed to get away with. I hope I'm less pessimistic than you about this not leading to change. I suspect that strategy at the moment is to sort of sit it out, see what happens. It's a summer story. They'll discredit me in some way. I've made it up. I'm not a serious historian. I'm a rabid Republican, and nothing to see here. Or they'll tinker at the edges and make some small changes. But I'm hoping that maybe it will light the touch paper and people will start emerging. And, for example, George Folks, who's a Labour peer, has been calling for to get rid of the tradition of no parliamentary scrutiny of the royal family. And with the Labour government, we may see, that may be something to be pushed along. The MPs 20 years ago were talking about a royal register, which I think it's window dressing, but I think that would be something at least, particularly for those more minor figures like Zara Phillips, just to have a clearer sense of where they're making their money when they do brand endorsements. I do think there's room for a parliamentary investigation into Andrew as a trade envoy, with a lot of these ambassadors who wouldn't talk to me in some of these countries where I know things were going on, and I know they know what that was going on, but do feel that perhaps it's not their business to talk to a writer because they're Her Majesty's ambassador. But maybe with a parliamentary investigation, I don't have great hopes in parliamentary investigations because they're never very well briefed and they're just given the complete runaround. Di Davis, who's the head of the Royal Security, has been calling for the Met to look at the sex trafficking. And I think that would satisfy. I mean, there would again be a cover-up about it. I mean, I've put in FOIs about it and the investigations, and they will neither confirm nor deny if they actually even investigated. And maybe if this National Crime Agency happens, I mean, I suspect it'll be like investigations into Trump. The whole thing will sort of be the whole thing will be dry clean, nothing to be found. Maybe some collateral damage for someone, and that's it. But yeah, I do increasingly begin to think we're in a third world country.
What kind of things were going to go in the book about Beatrice and Eugenie?
Well, I have to be careful because some of the stuff again for libel, but I think just the whole way they behaved, again, the same sense of entitlement, the fact that they insisted on having security, for example, on their year off when there was no threat deemed any threat by the police, but Andrew insisted on it. They used the security basically as people to drive them home from nightclubs when they were drunk. And so there was a whole big debate about security. But I think, yeah, more recently, the fact that they have been popping up at a lot of places and dealing with a lot of particularly Middle Eastern rulers who don't have the most marvelous reputations, doing things that don't really fit in with their jobs. I mean, Eugenie works for an art consultancy. She shouldn't be. I think is it Beatrice or Eugenie has just opened a Saudi bank. What's the connection there? So there are various things that pop up. They're involved with charities, for example, where the financing of the charities are very opaque. And when you approach any of the people involved in any of these charities, they are not prepared to talk about what the family are doing. So you just it just begins to raise questions, and we talked about the lies that Andrew told in Newsnight. I mean, and how everyone started publishing pictures of Andrew running out of nightclubs sweating in at the same time as he saw Virginia Giuffre. Well, same thing with Sarah Ferguson. She claims that she had no contact with Epstein after 2000 and beginning of 2011, when she supposedly then first discovered what he'd been up to. And yet I've got people saying that she was staying in one of Epstein's flats just around the corner from 71st Street up to 2014, 2015. And these are neighbors. This is the Doormen confirming it. Doormen actually said that when Fergie was staying there, and it was frequently, they would put on their full dress uniform. I mean, so, I mean, they really put the boat out for her. And even one of Ghislaine's friends, who's one of my sources, talks about how often Fergie was going there. And this is a person who made a statement saying, I abhor paedophilia. I would have nothing to do with a man like this ever again. And there she is, basically sponging off him for years afterwards. So the disconnect between what they say and how they behave makes you think that there's a lot more that's going on we just don't know about.
Yeah, and there was also a telling story in your book about I can't remember if it was Beatrice or Eugenie, but it was the Royal Opera House, and she said she only wants the sort of people who shop at John Lewis, which is a telling and kind of damning
Well,
anecdote.
And also, it was Eugenie, and it was also they then were trying to put pressure on the English National Ballet to move to a different system that her company used. They were trying to sort of basically drum up business, and they already were in a contract.
Yeah, it was
And
an
then,
auction
in
thing, wasn't
fact, Andrew goes, and I've got this now from three different people. I mean, one person I've known since university who was there. Andrew saying, "I'll be patron of you as a business school if you will give," I think it was Eugenie, "a free MBA." Really blatant corruption. Yeah, I mean,
it? Did
there are
you
lots and lots of stories like that.
And did you get an idea of what the relationship is like between Beatrice and Eugenie and Andrew? Was there any notion at all that they were angry with their father or disappointed in their father or grown distant from their father because of these scandals, or not at all?
I was told that they'd had counselling to deal with the stuff that had come out. Publicly they're always very loyal. But it was interesting, I thought, at Christmas when Andrew and Fergie didn't go to Sandringham and were left to stay at Royal Lodge, that Beatrice decided to go up to Sandringham with the cousins and didn't join her parents back at Sandringham at Royal Lodge, which I think a lot of children would have done. So that suggests a sense of distancing herself. I think, I suppose like any child, you have a loyalty to your parents and perhaps recognize their faults. But I think the danger is that in some ways they've been brought up with this culture that they can take freebies. They've been used to staying on Roman Abramovich's yacht and going and staying with Richard Branson. And there was a story that Beatrice's boyfriend Paolo Luisi told of them saying, "Well, we get these free flights on this business only airplane, and if you want a free flight anytime, just tell them, you use our name." And there's an awful lot of this basically. I mean, people are stupid, but upgrading them, giving them free things, letting them borrow dresses and not worry if they return them. I mean, Harrods, Mohammed Fayed basically turned a blind eye to the if they wanted to shop there, and he didn't to charge them anything. And then all these stories of hotels where well, certainly Fergie runs up huge room service bills and just assumes that someone else will pay for them. It's back to that woman, that hotelier Hemsley, Leonora Hemsley, who said only, it's only the little people.
Yeah.
And there is this attitude, and it's odd from someone who wasn't born into that. I mean, you wouldn't find Sophie Wessex or the Princess of Wales behaving like that. And I think it's just if you've been brought up and there are no proper moral boundaries, and in some ways you've got away with all this stuff, it's not surprising that you should continue the same sort of behavior yourself.
What do we know about the relationship between Andrew and Charles? There's always these reports coming out that Charles wants him out of the Royal Lodge, and Charles is disgraced, all this kind of stuff with Andrew. But there doesn't seem to be any action behind that. What do we know about the relationship between them? And do you think there's any chance that Charles will, in any way, hold Andrew to account?
No, I don't think Charles will. I mean, the relationship is complex. I mean, it's a certain amount of jealousy there. Andrew sort of felt he could do a better job than Charles. Charles, jealous of Andrew, who he felt didn't have this preordained life ahead of him. He could go and join the Navy. He had good looks, where Charles was a bit diffident, particularly with women. Andrew was very confident. So I think, there were rivalries on both sides. I think increasingly Charles has seen that the reputational damage that Andrew is providing, but he doesn't really want to address it. He's taken away some of the funding. I mean, clearly we had the siege of Royal Lodge where he was leaking stories to the press about trying to get Andrew out. The problem is that Andrew has a lease. As long as he follows the terms of that lease, it's impossible to get him out. Andrew isn't going to leave because, however bad the optics are, that's his last bit of status. He's nothing now after that. He feels he's lived there 20 years. He's put work in. His children, have been brought up there. He wants to have the grandchildren there. So I think that's a fight that's going to be quite difficult to win. But I think also Charles, a bit like the Queen in her later life, didn't puts her head, I would say, sits on the fence and sticks her head in the sand at the same time. that he's hoping to sort of kick the problem down the road and either hope it goes away or someone like William will deal with it. And it's difficult to know what he can do. I mean, he can. People are now talking about things being taken away from Andrew. I mean, it's crazy. He's still a Knight of the Garter, it seems to me. I think an honorary vice admiral. I think he's still a Councillor of State. That it seems to be quite a simple matter of latent letters patent to remove him as a duke and a prince and things. So there are things that could be done, and I think there's a public feeling that something should be done. And I think it's ridiculous that Sarah Ferguson, 30 years after a divorce, still markets herself as the Duchess of York. And without that, I'm sure she wouldn't be opening shopping arcades in downtown Detroit.
But again,
Yeah, I think there should be change, but whether it comes, I just don't know. I mean, I don't think there's enough of a public appetite yet, because I mean, Sunday Times and Channel 4 have done pieces on royal finances and pretty shocking things about the Duchy of Lancaster and Cornwall, arguing that more of this money should be basically come back to the state and there should be smaller allowances. And no one seemed to get too upset. The reason that Andrew lost his job as special trade envoy was about Epstein, nothing to do with concerns about, basically the embarrassments that he was causing and the damage. And it's a bit the same with my book. I want to keep it focused on the finances, and in some ways I regret putting some of the private life stuff in, which I felt was important, telling the story of him in a biography. But that's kind of overshadowed, I think, the more important story. I mean, I've always stressed it's a story of financial corruption rather than sexual scandal. And yet, the press have reported the juicy sort of salacious stuff rather than, I think, the more important stuff about how the system is being abused.
One thing that's really interesting, you mentioned the Sunday Times there, and I was going to ask about this. It seems to me that the only, basically, Rupert Murdoch is about the only one brave enough to take on King Charles, because it was the Sunday Times that broke the story about Fawcett, and they've broken all sorts of stories about the monarchy, which should have been profoundly important stories that caused earthquakes. But again, they just disappear. They just disappear again, and that's what's so frustrating.
I mean, it's back to the Royal Rota, and it's certainly my bugbears that the people who've written on the royals, whether journalists or biographers, they rely on the palace basically to feed them the tidbits on the access, and so they aren't going to spoil that. And so time and time again, stories are shut down. I mean, I had an experience at the beginning of the year where I did a podcast where I was quite disobliging about Sarah Ferguson, and the paper wrote it up. And then I noticed it had been removed, and I discovered later that her lawyers had complained about the piece, but she'd given an interview to that paper. So, I mean, there's this sort of what I call the Max Clifford school of PR that's going on the whole time. And I think some of the royal journalists are frustrated, particularly the ones who are broadcast journalists and outside the Royal Rota who are abroad, because they're not given the sort of the juicy tidbits. And most of the stories, the big stories that are broken, have been often just leaks from the palace rather than any independent investigation. These diversionary tactics, and I think it seems to go. It's not just with their comms teams, but actually some of the individuals themselves. I mean, I talk in the book about Fergie and Diana's relationship, and I think part of that was concerns were about one leaking information about the other. In fact, I think they both did it against each other.
Let's just talk as well now about the next generation. So let's talk about William and Harry. So firstly, can you just tell the story of what happened with Harry and Prince Andrew? I know there were two occasions. So can you just talk us through what happened there? And then after that, talk us through the relationship between William and Andrew.
According to a source who works for Andrew and who overheard the conversation, there were two incidents. The first in 2013, where there was a punch up. Andrew, who I think is the godfather of Harry, was saying, "You need to get your life in order." And Harry reacted violently to that, saying, "Well, you're one to talk." The second episode was in 2017, and this was Andrew saying to Harry, "Look, I don't think Meghan is suitable. Have you done your due diligence, etc." And we know that William had the same concerns. I was doing researching my Mountbatten book at the time, and I remember people telling me exactly the same about Meghan then. So I don't think that's surprising. we remember in 2017 it was a separate incident, but actually Andrew turned up with a bruised eye, and I asked if this was connected, and I was told that actually that was a separate thing. It was a businessman he'd fallen out with and who'd given him a punch. So, but we were never, told what that was about. But Harry seems to have taken exception to the fact that this fight when he issued a statement saying this is all made up, it's not true. I went back to my source and they confirmed it. Um, the publishers have now put a line in the book saying Harry denies this. So and I hope that will be the end of the matter. We'll see. But we've got to remember that Harry does have a history of throwing punches at people. He has a history of suing the Mail, who he also sued as well as the publishers, or threatened to sue. I mean, all I would say is my lawyers don't seem worried at all. They described it as a letter 2 out of 10 in terms of its seriousness. So I think it was just a gesture. He wanted clearly to defend his wife's honor. I mean, it seemed to me he came out of that actually quite well. There's no question of it being defamatory, so it's very difficult to know what actually he's complaining about.
And Prince William, what's the relationship there?
Well, I mean, it's very well known that the relationship with Prince William is not good. They're two very separate characters. One of the point that my source said was that Andrew being very rude about Kate. I think possibly on a class-based basis. I'm not quite sure, but rather disparaging. Um, and he can be quite acerbic. So, but I think William also he's concerned about the reputation of the monarchy, and the last thing he wants is Andrew hanging around. And everyone says that William will be much tougher on him. We know that William, for example, had through gritted teeth was forced to give Andrew a lift to Crathy Church, I think, one day. And it's very obvious that William and Kate do avoid occasions where Andrew is present.
And so, do you think that William will deal with Andrew when he becomes king in the ways that we've spoken about that Charles could? So, for example, taking away his title, potentially taking away the Councillor of State. Do you think that William will carry on the moral abdication of duty? Or do you think he might finally deal with Andrew in such a way that he can?
Well, I think it depends when William comes to the throne. I mean, if that's in 10 years' time, then either Andrew may have been sorted out, everyone may have forgotten about him, uh, um, so there may be no need for William to do anything. But if it's in the next 2 years, then and King Charles hasn't done anything, then yes, I think he will be pretty decisive and do things. And I think it's interesting. The Palace leaked the Telegraph last week a story about the fact that there were options to get rid of titles for Andrew. And I think they want to deal with Andrew and Harry in some ways the same way. The two problem princes are slightly different problems, but they're two individuals who drag down the rest of the royal family, and they clearly would like to marginalize.
There are hints throughout the book about Andrew's sexuality. So for example, and there's one bit where you talk about how he like, or somebody told you he likes kind of young men or something, kind of men in there. There were men as well as women being taken to his room in Thailand, I think it was. Is that right?
Yeah.
Do you think that maybe that's where the blackmailing comes in more than the women? Do you think that it might be videos of him and men that have the hold over him, especially with his generation's approach to homosexuality, very, very different to our generation's approach to it, and of
Yeah,
course,
yeah.
within
Uh,
his class as well.
I mean, I have a whole file on the stories I've been given about Andrew's, let's say, bisexuality. And these rumors go back many years. The problem was I didn't find any first-hand evidence. I mean, and I know ITN, for example, investigated this and got nowhere. There have been reports in sort of scandal rags. I had a lot of people talk to me, I don't know, army officers' wives saying that he has a place that he uses. Um, yeah, it's always been secondhand material. But these rumors go back. I mean, even at school, he was called nonce. So these rumors are around. There's stories of him being caught, variations of it, either caught in Buckingham Palace or by Fergie or in on board ship. I got someone yesterday gave me a story about a great friend of hers who had an affair with Andrew, which included them sleeping together at Balmoral. And she named this individual who's a senior figure in HR for one of the major companies. So, there's quite a lot of circumstantial evidence. I mean, I've had someone came to me the other day saying he had this girlfriend who was a nurse at St. Thomas's, and she told him that Andrew had been in for HIV, and that was, of course, a big rumor that ran around. So, it's difficult. I mean, also, there are issues of privacy. I mean, being bisexual isn't a crime. And I think the publishers felt that a lot of this stuff was salacious and not really relevant to the story. I mean, some of the stuff I put in about sex life was about his way of treating people and about perhaps, how his life had been shaped by his early sexual experiences. That I didn't think was they didn't think was so important. But if more and more people come that are forward with stories, then I'll certainly look at it for the paperback. The
Yeah,
story
I
in
mean,
Thailand comes from the Andrew's driver talking to another driver who was the driver for my source, who's a very high up person in Thailand. And that is bringing ladyboys in effect to parties that Andrew was holding. Now, whether that was for Andrew or for someone else, one doesn't know. And sometimes one kind of floats these things in the book just to see what happens and if it just winkles some people out.
did you get any idea or notion that there were other girls who were paid off by Andrew that we don't know about?
Yeah, I've been told there've been lots. And I think one of the interesting questions, and it's often put to me, why, if he's such a Lothario, why haven't there been more kiss and tell? But I think he pays them off. I think a lot of them are people within his circle that clearly would lose their status. Some of them, in the way that the poor girls that were trafficked for Epstein were young girls from Russia who couldn't speak English, who are in no position to sort of speak out, and if they did, would be frightened. But yeah, I think there is a terrific loyalty around some of the people. But I'm sure I've been told he's paid off lots and lots of people.